All right, hello again. Welcome back, nearly done. So last time started to talk about decoherence, gave a bit background on how to describe it in a general sense, and scratched on the most, universal kind of mainstream formalism that's used to describe decoherence effects, at least in an experimental setting, or to understand experiments. Theoretically, you can, of course, go much beyond. What I'd focus on for a large fraction of today is a particular kind of decoherence due to the interaction of electron spins and nuclear spins, where we have a pretty nice detailed understanding of the system. Then probably also say a little bit about charge decoherence, qubit control, some ongoing work, and 2-qubit operations, and some thoughts about scalability, where these semiconductor systems need to go in order to, build a quantum computer. So, actually this is crossed out. First I'll talk a little bit about, background, and then how to measure and manipulate nuclear spins using the qubit. How we can operate the qubit actually as a feedback loop to suppress fluctuations and extend coherence. It's a somewhat unusual technique, not the standard spin echo that many of you may know, but then also come to spin echo and dynamical decoupling techniques that are quite successful here, and also tell you a lot about the system dynamics. So if you look at the electron in gallium arsenide, it's an S-band, S-type conduction band. So the microscopic orbitals peak at the site of the nuclei, just like hydrogen atoms. And then the electron has an envelope wave function that's typically some 50 nanometers wide and overlaps with on the order of 1 million nuclear spins. And you can actually, if you want to understand the interaction, you can think of each nucleus as a little coil that has a magnetic moment. And then ask, with what probability is the electron inside this coil? If it has a finite size, this would happen. And then write down average magnetic field. Let the size shrink to 0. If you keep the dipole moment of the nuclear spins fixed, the volume goes to 0, but also the magnetic moment diverges. So what you end up in the end is a B field that behaves like a delta function, with the magnetic moment of the nuclear spins being the prefactor. And if you then average or compute the average Siemens splitting seen by the electron spin, this is the electron spin operator with this spatially dependent nuclear field, weighted with a probability of the electron being at the site of each nucleus, you end up with this hyperfine contact interaction. Contact because it's really just on site when the nucleus and electron are at the same place. And in the end, it has this isotropic form of an I dot S, I being nuclear spins, S being the electron spin. So just like an exchange interaction with a prefactor here that is, some constant and contains the probability of the electron actually being at that site. Now, in the end, if you just average over nuclear spin states, it means that the electron feels an effective magnetic field arising from all these little nuclear magnets. And if you have a completely random state, due to the very large, even at 100 millikelvin, the temperature is large compared to the nuclear Siemens splitting, so you have a nearly infinite temperature state. And if you just count the number up and down spins, that follows the square root n statistics. And as a result, the total field that one sees is the coupling constant divided by square root number of spins, random walk or averaging type physics, and that is typically 2 millitesla or so, a few millitesla. Now, if this field was completely static, we wouldn't care. Okay, we've built a magnet, but there's all sorts of interactions between the nuclear spins. For example, nuclear spins can exchange spin with each other. They go from this configuration to this configuration. Like here, these are called flip-flops, for example, due to the dipolar coupling between nuclear spins. If that happens multiple times, a local polarization can diffuse out of the dot. So you may initially have a higher polarization here that can move out, or a high polarization, always randomly generated, can move in from the outside towards the inside. These are processes that take scale typically on the scale of seconds to minutes, because it involves many spin flips. Each individual flip is about 100 microseconds set by the interaction strength. And since this leads to a time evolution, a random time evolution of this effective magnetic field, the electron decoheres. What you say also plays a role is the Larmor precession of the nuclear spins. They all precess around an external magnetic field. And that happens typically on the time scale of a fraction of a microsecond, depending on the external magnetic field. But then the dephasing of this precession, which also plays a role, so nuclei dephase, and that dephasing is seen in the electron coherence, happens on the scale of 100 microseconds. So that's just to give you a bit of a sense of the time scales involved of the intrinsic nuclear dynamics. So I'd just like to run, also because it's a nice example of how this system operates, run you through some free induction decay measurement that can actually be used to measure the instantaneous value of the nuclear hyperfine field, or more precisely the difference between the two dots. So here's our two electron system again, with two dots, each of them feeling or having an ensemble of about 1 million nuclear spins. And so what I tell you now is just a standard qubit operation sequence based on the principle we've discussed yesterday. So you start out with both electrons in one dot. That means they relax into a singlet state, because that's the lowest energy on this side of the Bloch sphere. Then they are separated. One electron is adiabatically put across to the other dot, still staying in the singlet state. Now they feel the different local magnetic fields. So the hyperfine field gradient, effective magnetic field gradient or difference between the two dots, drives this evolution around the z-axis of the Bloch sphere. And the frequency of that is just given by the difference in the local magnetic fields, and that is dominated by the difference in the hyperfine fields if you don't have micromagnets in there. So this measurement can be done relatively quickly in a fraction of a second at a single precession measurement, and could like this. So you look at the average charge sensor. This is your readout sensor. At the end of the cycle, you bring the electrons back. If it's a singlet, it goes back to 0, 2. If it's a triplet, they remain stuck in 1, 1. So if you average the charge sensor signal over many runs, you get the probability of either being in a singlet or triplet state. This probability oscillates as a function of the evolution time here, so how long you've let this thing precess. And the frequency of this solution can be fitted on the fly while the experiment is running. Just gives you the current value of the hyperfine field. So if you repeat this measurement many times, what you can actually see is a real-time trace of the nuclear magnetic field, or this Overhauser field from the nuclear spins. And the noise you see in here is not measurement noise. It's really the actual fluctuations of the nuclear spins happening on the scale of, well, seconds to minutes, as you can see. So you can follow in real time what is the current value of the polarization of about 1 million or 2 million nuclear spins. So we can measure the nuclear field. We can go further. We can also manipulate it. And then it starts to be a little bit like video gaming to run these experiments. So the trick here is to go to this transition between the S and T plus. There's two ways to manipulate it. Either you start with a T plus state, initialize that just by relying on the Zeeman splitting, and then you sweep from here through this transition. Remember, if you zoom in here, that's an avoided crossing. So if you do that slowly enough, the system will stay in the ground state, move across like this. And it turns out that since the matrix element that drives transitions between S and T plus is mediated by transverse nuclear fields, and there's an angular momentum change here, that angular momentum is transferred to the nuclear spins. So if you do this, on the one hand, the electrons change a spin, but at the same time, the nuclear spin is also polarized. Ideally, every time you do this, every time you send an electron through, you have one spin flip and polarize. And, well, in this case, the electronic quantum or angular momentum changes by -1. So nuclear spins are polarized in one direction. You can also initialize over here, do the same thing in reverse. Standard singlet initialization, sweep through this way. And then the angular momentum changes in the opposite direction. Okay, now my pointer is dead. I'll try to continue talking. Yeah, I just need spare batteries already prepared. Actually, yeah. Okay, works. So from that you can see that you can polarize the nuclear spins using this qubit in both directions. Now naively you would think both dots are actually polarized equally because you have equal superpositions between left and right, but in practice it turns out you polarize somewhat differently, probably just because of slight difference in the wave function size and different matrix elements. It's actually not completely established, but makes sense. And then it turns out that one has bidirectional real-time control of the gradient. So let me show you what I mean by this. Here you again see a time trace of the instantaneous value of this nuclear hyperfine field. Again, each point is one precession frequency measurement here. And while we are pumping, while loading singlets, repeatedly at a rate of something like 4 megahertz, so 4 million cycles per second, the hyperfine field increases. Then as soon as you switch to the other type of pumping, it decreases again. Here we've just driven back and forth between different limits, but you can see that you can basically control the hyperfine field at will and set it to any value you like. One simple possibility is then actually to create a steady state when relaxation compensates the pumping. It will equilibrate somehow. And what you then see is that you have a finite polarization, can be up to a few hundred millitesla or so. Here it's a smaller field, which is easier to control. And it fluctuates around this mean value just the same way it would fluctuate around 0 if you had no induced polarization at all. So to summarize that, on the one hand, we can measure the instantaneous value of the field gradient. Well, here I say every second. It can actually be done in much less than a millisecond. I'll say something about that with ongoing progress. And we can also manipulate the nuclear polarization between the measurements and thus steer it to essentially any value we like. So what can we do with that? This gives us enough control to reduce the fluctuations and extend the coherence of the qubit. So if you just average your free induction decay, these oscillations over all these fluctuations, the qubit always precesses at a slightly different frequency, standard dephasing or T2 star effect. And if you average over these variations, then after some time, you're sometimes on a peak, sometimes on a valley. So on average, you have 0 contrast. So these oscillations decay relatively quickly. And the time scale associated with these 2 millitesla fluctuations are about 50 nanoseconds. Depends a bit on the details, but it's a pretty generic value. So that's just what you see here. So, and that was for a long time considered a major weakness and a showstopper for the system. It's certainly not very convenient, but I'll show you you can actually do something against that and even use these nuclear spins as a resource. So one possibility is just to teach your measurement computer to measure the value and then polarize according to the current value of the hyperfine field such that fluctuations are stabilized. So here, if you just have a fixed amount of pumping, you still have these fluctuations. Once you switch in this feedback, you see that the slow fluctuations are quenched, and that leads to an enhancement of T2 star. But you can actually do that more interestingly. Notice we use the qubit to measure the bath, send then the signal back to the measurement computer, and then use the same qubit to manipulate the bath. So maybe one can use the qubit, which is a small quantum computer after all, used to do the whole feedback itself and use it as a feedback loop, and in fact that works. So the idea here is to combine the evolution of the qubit in the current hyperfine field with the polarization. So we would initialize in a singlet state again, then go deep into 1-1. We go quickly through this crossing so nothing happens. Now we're on our usual Bloch sphere. The qubit will precess between singlet and T naught. Let's assume it does a full period, then it comes back to a singlet. If we now sweep back here through the transition, we do have a transition from singlet to T plus, and nuclear spins are polarized. So if we do this repeatedly, what will happen is the hyperfine field increases and the frequency of precession changes. Now after a while, our precession time is here, we do the same thing. The qubit precesses more quickly, so after the same time it might end up in a T0. If it now is in a T0, then sweeping back, it will stay in a T0. It doesn't go through this crossing, so there's no more polarization. And the polarization would decay again. And what happens in the end is, rather than have an oscillation, if you do things right, you just settle at an intermediate fixed point where you on average have the right amount of polarization, and any fluctuation away from this point will be counteracted by the operation of the qubit. And you can do this by only applying pulses to the qubit without measuring and interpreting the data on the scale that the feedback acts. So we're manipulating the qubit, repeatedly operating and polarizing it, but we don't need to interpret the data in order to get this feedback effect. And if you now interlace this feedback with measurements, so you can sometimes do feedback and polarize, sometimes measure to see what the effect is, you see that this T2 star of initially about 14 nanoseconds can be extended out to about 150 or so. Varies a bit from run to run how far it actually gets. And along with that, if you take a histogram of the distribution of these nuclear field fluctuations, you say that these initial 2 millitesla RMS fluctuations are narrowed a lot. And that's just, again, the narrowing of the distribution, which is the Fourier transform of this decay. So if you have a narrower distribution, the decay is more slowly because you sample from fewer frequencies. Right, any questions on that? Yes?
So can we also save the qubit state into the spins from the
Right, so good question. Can you save the qubit state in the nuclear spin state? In principle, it certainly works. It works very nicely in silicon systems where you have a single donor spin attached to an electron. It's done in NV centers, or again, where there's few nuclear spins. There are proposals to do this here, but they essentially rely on some kind of nearly complete polarization. And I think in practice, if you take all the terms into account, that's essentially impossible to obtain because there's so many spins, they behave differently. It's nuclear spins, they dephase too quickly. So I don't think this is a practical approach if you really think about the experimental details. But who knows what people will invent in the future. All right, so this is one way to stabilize nuclear spins, and this is actually, it's not just we can do this once, it's really a standard technique that is used on a daily basis in the lab now in order to control the qubit, because you need this hyperfine field gradient in order to drive the precession of the qubit and get full control. So it's, these nuclear spins are not only a nuisance, they actually can be used as a resource, and one advantage is that you can set any value of the nuclear spins in situ. So if you had a micromagnet, it would be much harder to change the field gradient that that thing produces. I'd also like to outline one advancement building on this from the Harvard group, where they've really optimized how quickly the information about the nuclear spins can be extracted and gives pretty neat results. So what you see here is a histogram, or is rather a color plot, where each pixel, each time trace, each x slice in the x-axis corresponds to a certain evolution time of the qubit under the influence of the hyperfine field. Then the y-axis is the readout voltage of the single-shot RF readout, normalized to standardized units. And the color axis tells you how many counts you had at this particular evolution time and this voltage. And so you see here with 150 repetitions, so 150 points in each slice, you start in a singlet, mostly have points at the singlet value. Then after some time, the qubit precesses and goes to the triplet and comes back. So in the single shot, you never see values in between. You just see the probabilities changing. And if you just take the average for each slice, you see these nice oscillations. That's the same kind of curve I've shown before. But it kind of gives you an idea how, from a relatively small number of measurements, this precession comes about. you can now average much longer, take instead 30,000 repetitions, and the fluctuations are gone. You just see these blobs. You also see, because you average over more nuclear fluctuations, the decay is faster. But now you can ask, well, how do I do this measurement the most effectively in order to, as quickly and efficiently as possible, measure the nuclear hyperfine field? Do I need these 150 repetitions over 200 different points, or how much better can I do? And now if you think about it, on the one hand, it's good to measure at long times, because then you have a steep slope. If you let the qubit evolve for a long time, a small change in hyperfine field will lead to a large change in qubit state. On the other hand, if you just measure out here, you would lose track of how many oscillations have happened, so you would only kind of get a answer modulo your periodicity. So you also need the short times here. So somehow you want to cover everything, but interpret that as effectively as possible. And one thing that our theorist friends have invented is or proposed and analyzed in detail is a Bayesian estimate. So one keeps track of a probability distribution of the nuclear field value, and then updates that probability distribution according to the laws of Bayes whenever a new measurement comes in. So every time you detect a singlet or a triplet, you update your information or probabilistic information about the nuclear spins. And here's an example how that would run. So you start with a Gaussian distribution just from your coarse measurements or where you polarized. And then does that work? Yes, now let that run. So every time measurement comes in, it gives you more information. Initially you saw kind of some wild evolution, but then eventually it narrows down on some very narrow peak after just a fairly small sequence of measurements, a few tens. Let's just jump back there again. So here you start out with something broad. You see it jump around. The first few measurements don't really tell you where you are, but then after a few tens, you have a nice sharp peak. And it turns out that you get a pretty good accuracy after just something like, I think, 200, 300 microseconds of measuring. Yes?
What for me looks a bit complicated is, how much more information you get depends on what kind of measurement you do next. So does this protocol have some kind of way to determine what kind of measurement you should do?
I think in this case it's not in there yet. So the question is, how do you select the measurements? You could, of course, think, well, which measurement gives you the most information, and which one do I do? There are some theory proposals on that, and depending on what constraints you do, you gain a little bit. They didn't do that here because that requires faster hardware response and more computing power than was available there. So I think they just either took a linear sweep or just a random selection of the time. So of course you need a good mix of slow or short time measurements to get a rough value of the nuclear field, and then narrow it down with longer evolution times. So what can one do with that? If you now take your T2 star measurements happening on or your free induction decay measurements happening on average, taking many repetitions over some extended time, and in each measurement rescale the time axis according to the currently measured or the best estimate of the nuclear hyperfine field. So just you estimate the value of the field, then check, what is my current hyperfine field, use that to rescale the time to basically work only in the units of the phase. Then it turns out that the effective T2 star arising from that, from the measured data, can be pushed out to about 3 microseconds. So that's the accuracy by which one can measure the nuclear field and then verify that coherence really is this long. Then one can even go a little bit further and use this estimation to adjust the frequency of a Rabi control field driving a qubit. I won't go into details there, but you basically wiggle the epsilon value to drive the qubit. This needs to be resonant with the current hyperfine field value. And again, doing that, one finds a T2 star of these oscillations on the scale of 2 microseconds. And here the difference is that instead of rescaling the time axis in post-processing, this is real data, but the manipulation field has been conditioned on this measurement in real time. So I think it's pretty cool to be able to measure these nuclear spins that quickly, and you get from 50 nanoseconds to 3 microseconds in T2 star. We're currently also thinking about other polarization techniques that are based on the same feedback idea discussed before, but have a better performance. And we expect that these should go to similar values. And then the, well, originally daunting 10 nanoseconds have improved a lot. It takes effort, it's complicated, but also fun. And if, well, it's not something that would completely stop the qubit from working.
T1 is the 1 second or so in these, or even longer? Or?
It depends on the field. The level splitting that we use is probably a bit smaller than was present in the 1 second measurement. Maybe a factor 2, it goes in as a forced power, so maybe it ends up being a few milliseconds. There may be co-tunneling to the leads, which might eventually be a limiting factor. So I think there's one measurement also from the Jacobi's where it goes into the millisecond range, depends a little bit where you are. And I think eventually it will play a role, but it's not a main concern yet, and probably can also be improved once it becomes an issue. Any other questions? All right. So all I've told you so far is basically dealing with relatively slow fluctuations. And slow meaning that they are so slow that we can do a measurement while they occur and react to it. It's actually fairly fast, but nevertheless, it's a speed limit. So what helps here is that these nuclear spins have fairly slow dynamics and don't move very fast. But one can also go further and look at the real intrinsic coherence time, T2 effects, the short time dynamics. And the method of choice there is to use Hahn echoes or spin echo techniques or more complicated dynamical decoupling techniques. And what I'll like to tell you is, first of all, what insight we gain of the nuclear dynamics. We get a really nice, pretty detailed picture of what's going on. And then also that we can extend coherence to at least 200 microseconds. I think that's not the limit yet. That might even have been T1 limited, but can be improved. I don't know to where. So the Hahn echo, many of you will know that from standard spin echo experiments. I'll just walk you through it for this particular experiment. So you start again in a singlet, let the qubit evolve under the influence of nuclear spins. But then you switch on an exchange pulse. This essentially does a pi pulse in this subspace or in this logical space. Or you can just think of the 2 electrons here swapping places. And then you let them evolve for the same amount of time again. And that turns out that, then you see that if the precession frequency around between these 2 states hasn't changed, it will return exactly back to the origin. Or a nice physical picture is that both electrons have seen the same nuclear field on average, and therefore there's no phase accumulated between those 2 states. But it's the same thing that you may be familiar from with the Bloch sphere picture where you use pi over 2 pulses, just the control techniques are matched to this qubit. So we can then, at the end of the measurement, again, this evolution measure what's the probability of being in a singlet or a triplet. If nothing has changed, we should come back to a singlet. But if the evolution or the precession frequency changes over the scale of this experiment, for example, if a nuclear spin flips, you would end up somewhere else and perhaps measure a triplet. And so the longer you make the total time, the more triplets you would expect to see, because first of all, you have more time to evolve, and also the qubit has more time to accumulate phase, and the system has more time to change its state. And if you do the measurement, you see that at high fields, there's a decay of roughly with an e to the minus t to the 4th decay. So these curves are all offset. One corresponds to unscaled, one corresponds to full coherence at short times, so returning to the initial state. and then after some 20, 30 microseconds, it starts to decay here. By the way, this t to the fourth decay is pretty generic for spin echoes. If you only have low frequency noise, it's basically just a very small high frequency tail of this low frequency noise that leads to this decay. And if you go through the numbers, you realize that on this time scale, the 30 microseconds correspond to roughly a single nuclear spin flipping. So if you were just saying the state of one nuclear spin after some 20, 30 microseconds would give you a similar picture. In practice, it's of course more on average over many nuclear spins, and the change from each flip-flop is small because if you swap these two, they both couple similarly to the electron. So it's many small changes of field, but still gives you a sense of the, well, sensitivity of this experiment. So far, okay, nice. Looks a little bit boring though. Things become more interesting if you go to lower fields. So you start these oscillations developing. As you lower and lower the field, it becomes slower and slower. And eventually, the coherence completely drops to 0, stays there, and then recovers after something like 10 microseconds or so. If you just stay out here, you'd think, okay, you have a few seconds, but actually something comes back. Any ideas for the non-insiders what this might be related to? Why could you see this field-dependent oscillation frequency? So what other dynamics is in the system that provides a time scale and changes with magnetic field? Exactly. So this is exactly the Larmor precession, or some part of it, of the nuclear spins. And I'll tell you in more detail how that works, because it's really nice that one can produce a pretty detailed model. By the way, these lines here are fits to the data. So the dots are data points, the rest is fits. So you see that not all measurements are as noisy as the ones we discussed on Tuesday. So how does this come about? It was actually first explained based on expressions that looked like this, and I found them a bit terrifying. But you see some resemblance here by the Dasama group. There's some work that gives a bit more intuitive picture, just giving or considering individual flip-flops of nuclear spins. But it turns out one can actually understand everything from a more semi-classical picture, just averaging over nuclear states and keeping track of the dynamics. But we need to extend our Hamiltonian a little bit. So if you look at the total Zeeman splitting of the qubit, it's given by the total magnetic field seen. And that consists of a contribution from the external field, then a nuclear spin contribution along the external field, but there's also nuclear spin polarization transverse. Some nuclei turn this way, point this way, and on average there's some horizontal field if your applied field is vertical as well. Then you do the vector sum of all of them, and since the external field is big, you can expand that and find that, the Z components all add linearly. That's just the Zeeman splitting. But then the correction from the transverse term adds quadratically. So you have this transverse nuclear field squared divided by the external field that contributes to the Zeeman splitting. And so your total Hamiltonian now in the reference frame that toggles or wiggles along with the nuclei looks like this. It's all proportional to SZ acting on the electron spin, but there are different contributions to the prefactor. Now we can ask, what do these terms do? The external field we assume is constant, it doesn't do much, and we'll just discuss a single electron, then 2 is twice a single electron, don't need to think much about that. Then there's one effect that lets this Z field fluctuate, and that's this flip-flopping of nuclear spins. So the Z field, as the nuclei evolve, just becomes bigger and smaller, and that can be connected to this exponential t to the fourth decay at high fields. And more interesting is the low field part, and to understand in detail, you need to know that there's 3 nuclear isotopes in gallium arsenide that have different gyromagnetic ratios. And so our transverse field that enters the Hamiltonian is the vector sum of all of them. So 3 is a bit complicated. Let's just look at 2 of them now. As time evolves, these will precess around each other at different rates. And this means that the magnitude or square of the transverse field undergoes the sinusoidal evolution just due to the relative Larmor precession. Now you see that if you average over a full period of this precession, so one period of the full Larmor period, then the net phase accumulated due to this fluctuating part is 0 and doesn't contribute to dephasing. So that's when the revivals occur. But if you have a different period, for example, or different accumulation time, for example, half a period, then this, depending on whether you take this one or this one, you have a different phase that averages out and you have no or little coherence left that leads to the collapses. So we understand where these collapses and revivals come from. Then on top of that, these don't persist forever, so there's still some decay. If it was just precessing at a fixed frequency, you might expect that these go on. It turns out that now the dephasing of the nuclear spins, so the fact that different nuclear spins rotate at or precess at slightly different frequencies, leads to a decorrelation of these oscillations, and that can be attributed or made responsible for this decay over time. So that's basically this effect as things precess this vector, because each single nuclear spin precesses a little bit faster or slower, the length of the total vector changes. And that, again, is a random fluctuation. So overall, we can fit all this data with essentially one set of parameters, number of nuclear spins. There's this diffusion contribution being dominant at high fields, but it's a small effect. And then another fit parameter that comes out is the spread of these Larmor frequencies of the nuclear spins that determines how fast the coherence time extends as you go to larger magnetic fields. Okay, so we were happy with that, but dug a little bit further. You now have a RMS field seen by nuclear spins. And coherence of nuclear spins, that's some kind of old technique. People know a lot about that. So you can go back to the literature and ask, well, does that actually match expectations? What you find is that, well, there's not a single value. If you look at gallium arsenide with impurities, charged impurities in it, you see that the NMR line width, which is basically the variance of this precession frequency that people measured here back in '74, depends, first of all, on the concentration of impurities. So more impurities there are, the bigger the line width. And second, it depends on the orientation of the magnetic field. And what they tell you, quite believably, what the origin is that if you have impurities, charged impurities, you have electric fields in the sample. These electric fields lead to a slight deformation of the lattice electrons or the band electrons. And that is seen by nuclear spins. This is supposed to be the wave function, so it becomes somewhat asymmetric. It's pushed this way by an electric field. And that means that the nucleus here doesn't have a symmetric environment anymore. It also sees an electric field gradient. And then if you have a nuclear spin with more than 1/2, for example, 3/2 is present here, that in general has a quadrupole moment, an electric quadrupole moment, which means it interacts with electric field gradients. That basically means the charge isn't distributed all homogeneously in the nucleus, but has this quadrupole moment interacting with a field gradient. And as a result, the 4 different levels of the nuclear spin obtain unequal spacing. And roughly speaking, you can think of that as the precession rate being somewhat broadened. So basically, depending on which transition you look at, the precession is a little bit faster and a little bit slower. And that explains why the line widths get bigger. So you can go through the numbers and estimate that given that you have an electron sitting there, you have the nuclei have their own impurities. So it's certainly reason to believe that there are electric fields, and if you estimate the magnitude, it's indeed compatible with having roughly this 3 Gauss broadening. Notice that here the minimum is on the order of 1 Gauss. Now, if this is true, one would expect a dependence on field orientation. So if you rotate your magnetic field, which is the x-axis here, this broadening should vary. And if you use a different alignment than we used in these experiments, you should see a longer decay. So we recently tried that you see here are different, either some intermediate field of 400 millitesla. You again see these slight oscillations from the relative Lama precession. And then we rotate the orientation of the magnetic field from 0 and 15 degree steps to 90 degrees. And well, on the one hand, you see indeed at 45 degrees, the coherence is extended. It's a different sample, so the overall scale is a bit shorter than before, but physics the same. But you also see these funny oscillations here, which are now much faster. Now, these are the ones we've seen before. Now we have much faster oscillations. So what could that be? We can again now go to 45 degrees, look at the field dependence. You see some irregular pattern, and again, as you increase the field, the oscillations become faster and become less visible. Here you have this kind of nice, very fast decay, then nearly nothing, a few blips, and back here, 20 microseconds, there's a little measured recurse here. And now there are, mostly you see data points, but if you look closely and zoom in, there's a continuous line here. That's a model fitting these data points, again, roughly with, apart from a few offsets, with one set of parameters. So we also know where these things come from. And any idea? So it's still nuclear spins, but now it's the absolute Lama precession. What we've seen before was the relative precession, so the difference between different species. Now it's the speed of each, or the precession of each single species, and the fact that you have 3 frequencies gives rise to these funny patterns that just superimpose. The reason we see them is that actually there's a slight anisotropy of the G factor seen by the electron. So that means the quantization axis or the precession axis of the nuclear spins and the electron spins are not fully aligned. And if the nuclear spins precess, then the transverse part of the nuclear precession basically has a small component also along the quantization direction of the electron, and therefore the electron sees this Lama precession. And we can also understand where this G factor anisotropy comes from. It's expected to be there. It's actually quite small, just 2.5%. According to the fits, and then generate a model that explains that. What I'd also like to mention is that there's 2 things that make this thing somewhat non-standard, the model. You have here quadratic coupling to the nuclear spins. The nuclear spins, since there are many, they are following a Gaussian distribution, so that would be quite standard statistics. But since you're coupling to a square of a Gaussian, it's not a Gaussian distribution anymore, and in principle that gives a different decay form. It's a little bit washed out here because there's different species, but that is taken into account, and the way these models are generated is simply by taking the classical precession of the nuclear spins and averaging over the Gaussian distributed initial conditions, so where do the nuclear spins point to at the beginning of each experiment, and that gives these curves. So the nuclear spins have no quantum behavior there. It's just a classical average dynamics, and the electron, of course, picks up a phase according to the level splitting. So when quantum mechanics show up is an interesting open question. I think it's around the corner, but hasn't really been seen in experiments yet. All right. Any questions on that? All right. So now what can you do in order to go further with experiment, with coherence, and really extend the lifetime? So far we've just applied 1 pi pulse to refocus the electron spin. A standard technique is to repeat that, so-called CPMG, Karp-Purcell, Maiboom-Gill. And it's basically a repetition of the echo sequence with several pi pulses. It was predicted that that can lead to a strong enhancement of the dephasing time. So here you see the kind of 30 microsecond scale decay from theory that we've seen. You can kind of think or understand that if you don't completely let the qubit decay, but start a new pulse before it is completely decayed, and then extend to here, you already see, or continue, you see that you would expand the longer coherence. In practice, there's even more correlations so that you would get to this curve and so on. So we've also done that experimentally. It's not quite so long with 6 pulses, but you see a significant additional increase. And if you take 16 pi pulses, we saw coherence extended to something like 200 microseconds of coherence, revolution time. One thing that's peculiar here is that it seems to be a linear decay. We can only speculate what that is. It might be a T1 effect or so. There's still also some artifacts in there which could be removed, and will be interesting to see where that can be pushed to. At some point, I think we'll do that. All right, so let me conclude there on the hyperfine interaction. If you do Hahn echo measurements, you get a pretty detailed understanding of what's going on. There's lots of features in the data, can all be explained on a semi-classical model. So it's debatable how important that is for quantum information, but it's a very nice, well-controlled system that also has been studied in quite some detail theoretically. And the nice thing is you have a lot of information about the Hamiltonian, relatively few fetch factors, and can get a good agreement between theory and data. We've seen that relatively small effects such as quadrupole coupling of nuclear spins to the lattice and G-factor anisotropies have pretty pronounced effects, which first time you try that often come at a surprise. So when we took this field dependence data, we were wondering, hey, what's these oscillations there? We didn't expect these, and then, well, developed the model later. And you also see that dynamical decoupling is highly effective at extending the coherence time, which again can be attributed to the fact that nuclear spins evolve very quickly, very slowly. All right, so maybe this is a good time for a little break, 5 minutes till 5 to 10, 5 to noon, I mean, and then I'll continue a bit with exchange operations and 2-qubit stuff. For the sake of completeness, I'd briefly like to discuss also another kind of dephasing, which I think in the end is much more universal to all spin qubits and might even break symmetries between different systems, say silicon and gallium arsenide. Right now the levels seem to be quite similar. And that is charge dephasing that affects the exchange oscillation, and then move on to 2-qubit things. So all the dephasing I've discussed so far took place over here with well-separated electrons where the nuclear spins are dominant. If you now go further to the right, you see that there's this additional exchange splitting. And if you now have electrical noise along this detuning axis, the level splitting will change, and that will cause additional decoherence. That fact isn't new. The very birth of the qubit already showed that under these exchange oscillations, there's only 3 coherent oscillations. By now it's a bit better, but this can be attributed to charge noise. So basically it's, again, the swapping of the electrons. It's with a fluctuating rate due to electrical noise. And we can also measure that. Again, this is data from Harvard. And now you see that depending on where you bias the qubit, the precession rate changes. And then, at least here, the slower it gets, also the longer the coherence time. Roughly the number of oscillation becomes constant. And that's because this dephasing time is proportional to, or inversely proportional to, how strongly this exchange coupling, so the splitting between here and here, reacts to epsilon changes. So this derivative dj d epsilon. And as you go further into 1,1, j becomes smaller, the precession becomes smaller, but also the qubit is less sensitive. And then up here, nuclear spins kick in. Here you see the scaling in this region at relatively large j. The scaling with dj d epsilon independently measured works quite well. Again, this is mostly due to low frequency noise, which then turns out to be on the scale of about 8 microvolts RMS, probably due to charge fluctuations in the sample. One can also, again, do a spin echo, just as before, but now we are switching the axes. We are first evolving around j, then switching off j, do a pi pulse around the small static nuclear spin. So we don't have exactly orthogonal axes, but close enough. Gives a T2 measurement. Can be fitted with a power law decay. Again, you get a T2 in the microseconds now, which varies with the exchange coupling. Again, the faster the qubit evolves, the faster it also decoheres. And again, the number of coherent oscillations per T2, that's what we call Q factor, is now a couple of hundred, 1 second, and changes a little bit, but not too much. And all of this suggests that it sees the qubit sees a spectral density with a 1/f to the 0.7 type. I think it's likely to come from charge traps, but there's no independent proof. So I think I've seen you first. Pardon?
Why do you have a rounding?
Right, so why is this the rounding? You had an exact exponential decay if it's complete Markovian noise. That would be the green curve here. If you have a Markovian noise, means that the spectrum is white. So the noise spectrum is just uncorrelated, it's constant in frequency. What this fits best is a 1/f-like with an exponent of 0.7 here. So the spectral density is proportional to 1/f to the 0.7. And that gives rise to this rounding. So you can, this is an e to the minus t to some power again, and this exponent is directly related to this one.
Does Q also include the manipulation?
So Q here does not include manipulation in that point. It's really just as a function of time without any manipulation. There's, of course, additional visibility loss due to the pi pulse, due to inverting the qubit, but since this is independent of the time scale, it cancels out and is not included in these measurements.
So how many gate controls do you do?
Depends. I'll say a little bit about that later, depending on time. If not, you can stop by. All right. Now, one thing that's quite peculiar is the temperature dependence of this noise. You see that the T2, as you increase the temperature from about 50 millikelvin to 300, varies roughly as inverse temperature squared. So this, in some way, is a surprisingly strong temperature dependence. Again, I can only speculate that it's due to charge traps in the substrate, but we don't understand that in detail. All right, so here are the gates. Few things on gate control. If you now took these coherence measurements, look at both charge, hyperfine mediate dephasing, look at T2 star and T2 based on the echo or CPMG, and then estimate the probability or the gate error probability based on naive numbers. Basically, what's the, if you let your qubit process half a turn, what's the probability of being in the wrong state? Then you get values in the range of 1% or even 10 to the minus 4 from rough estimates. And so we were asking ourselves how and if these can actually be realized, because the estimates are relatively naive and they're certainly not verification. What is the actual accuracy of gate operations? And that is somewhat non-trivial, because if you look at this control Hamiltonian, first of all, you have these slow fluctuations that you somehow want to deal with. Also, your control is nonlinear. So standard approaches based on Rabi pulses, people have thought about similar problems there, of course, before, are not directly applicable. In order to be fast and not dephase too much, you need very large pulses, a strong variation of J, and everything becomes highly nonlinear. And so we thought, how can we do this? Here's basically a result of experimentally reconstructed trajectories around different axes with different exchange splitting. So this looks quite nice. And you have at your disposal rotations around all these different axes shown here, but only in this first quadrant by varying J. Furthermore, there are certain hardware constraints. Your pulse generators have a fixed clock cycle, can only update their output voltage about once a nanosecond, otherwise it becomes annoyingly expensive and more noisy. Also, there's finite rise times. They do not update instantaneously, so many of the analytic or intuitive constructions don't work directly. And we started to do numerics and then just optimize pulses that do what we want them to do. And a typical result would look like this. So this is the actual pulse applied. This is what the qubit sees. And well, it doesn't have any clear structure, but roughly gives the qubit 3 kicks as it processes around the Bloch sphere. And it turns out then, based on, well, a best effort estimate of the dephasing or infidelity based on the measured experimental data, error rates on the order of 0.2% should be reachable. And we are currently working on the implementation. We are not quite at 0.2% yet, but our current qubit isn't as coherent. It's more in the mid-90s or so, but I'm working on that. In principle, this idea of using optimized pulses seems to work, or numerically designed pulses. All right, so does that roughly answer your question? So details, once you start to go into control, one could do a whole lecture of its own on whether T2 star effects, T2 effects are important. We just discussed that a little bit in the break. Well, don't have that much time. All right, any questions on charge dephasing control? So then let's come to 2 qubits. Give a bit of an overview of different approaches available and what has been done, then focus on one experiment that has really realized an entangling gate on these 2 electron spin qubits. So if you use single spins, the most convenient way is to just do what we do all the time, namely use an exchange interaction. If you think in the Bloch sphere of 2 spins, this just of the 2 electron spin qubit drives around this axis. But now if you think of each of these as an individual qubit, you see that the up-down state gets mapped onto up-down plus I down-up. So entangled state where the 2 spins are now entangled, similar to a singlet. And this operation is called the square root of swap because you just go half as much as a complete swap. And this can be shown to be one universal 2-qubit gate. If you combine that with other single qubit gate, it's as good as the more familiar C0 gate. It's sufficient for universal quantum computing. So in principle, having exchange, we can check off single qubit gates for single spins. But people have pushed that a little bit further and actually made progress in implementing that. So here again, you see a double quantum dot, but each is operated individually as 1 qubit. And now one does the spin selective readout with electron spins tunneling out and into the dot if they're in excited state in both dots separately. So on the left you see the 2 time traces. Again, each blip here would correspond to an excited spin state. And by measuring both dots simultaneously, you can get correlations between the 2 dots, as you would expect from entanglement. And, well, so for example, here you see different probabilities for the 3 or 4 possible measurement outcomes. You do 2 measurements, one on each qubit, 2 outcomes, so it's 4 possibilities. And indeed, some of these do show, depending on the initial state, the expected oscillation. So if you have in your initial state an up-down component, then this one swaps places and the mixed probabilities here oscillate as an exchange operation is executed. I'm not going to explain these 2. So coherent exchange with simultaneous readout works. This would correspond to a square root swap, but since the measurement was only in one basis of the 2 qubits, the experimental proof of entanglement is not there yet. It doesn't say that because there's no other measurements that it is an entangled state. So in order to show that, one would need, in addition, some single spin control. And I think at least a while ago they were planning to do that. I'm not sure if that experiment is still active. Maybe the Delft people know something about that. Okay, so now let's move to single triplet qubits, 2 electron spin qubits. How can we do multiple qubit gates there? One possibility here that has evolved and refined over time, this is the latest version from one of David's students. It's the simplest approach, I think, or simplest gate sequence. So anyway, the idea here is that, well, you have 2 spins again, each defining 1 qubit, and you also make use of an exchange interaction between 2 of the spins in 1 qubit. In addition, you need some single qubit gate just to get your axes right. I'm not going to say much in detail about that. And the basic idea here of this construction is, well, you do something to each qubits individually. Actually, these boxes should go over, connect both spins, but it doesn't matter much. And now you do an exchange operation, but in this Bloch sphere of the second and the third spin, if you just think of that as a single triplet qubit for a moment, you do a complete turn between, say, the up-down state and the down-up state. I'm just considering 2 particular initial states. And that means you do essentially nothing. So you return back to the same state, which is important. I'll tell you why. But because you go around here, you accumulate a phase shift just from the energy associated with this evolution. On the other hand, if you had a different initial state, like this one, so down, up in one qubit and up, down in the other, that means the inner two spins are in a T plus state, so both up, then nothing happens here, and you don't accumulate this phase. So overall, this effect is that the effect of this operation is that the 0, 0, or likewise the 1, 1 state with different spins on the inner two dots acquire a phase, the other ones don't. And if you get to do things right, you get a C phase or C naught gate with these correction states. One thing to point out here is that at the intermediate state, when you're over here, you're partially in this state that, well, is a down up for the two inner spins, but if you take the outer ones again as well, this corresponds to a down, down, up, up. So these are not computational states. You temporarily leak out of the computational subspace or take the qubit out and then back in again. And this is what makes these exchange-based two qubits gate a bit tricky, is that you need to watch out that at the end of the gate, you're back in your computational subspace and don't lose population to other states. It's not a fundamental issue, it seems, but needs to be engineered and thought through carefully. So I think this is a quite promising approach and worth trying in the future. It takes more pulse shaping and pulse engineering, so it's not a trivial thing. What we decided to do first is something simpler, use a Coulomb coupling, so charge interaction between two qubits. So you have now here a device with two electron spin qubits, each circle making up one, placed next to each other, so they're capacitively coupled. And now we make use of the fact that depending on the operating point, the singlet states, you can think of them as one electron being partially transferred to the other one due to the other dot due to this slight virtual occupation of the doubly occupied state. And the important thing is that this now has a different charge distribution than the triplet state, and these different charge distributions couple coulombically and can introduce or generate also a C phase gate. Few technical things, so we now have two qubits, so we want to read out two of them and use frequency multiplexing for that. So this is the same, somewhat simplified depiction of our RF readout circuit. Now we have two tank circuits with slightly different frequencies, so LC resonance circuits reading different charge sensors, working with two frequencies at the same time. We can read out both qubits simultaneously. Here you see the two resonance curves, and one responds just to one qubit and one responds to the other. So the different curves here are the conductances of the charge sensors. So a bit of engineering, but in the end it works. Now one problem is when the qubits should talk to each other, they need to have some charge degree of freedom. So they need to be charge sensitive and have a charge density, otherwise they dephase, they don't talk to each other. That means they're also sensitive to charge noise. And if you use the T2 star values without any echo, the experiment would be hopeless. So therefore, we do a spin echo technique, which consists of doing a pi pulse to invert the state on both qubits simultaneously. And now you're insensitive to slow fluctuations in the environment because of the pi pulse. But as you're flipping both qubits at the same time, the coupling is maintained. Basically, you get 2 times the cancellation, and the cancellation cancels out. Well, and so you can still maintain the qubits coupled over the pulse sequence. So in detail, for example, you would start an up-down state, let both qubits precess, and now the exact precession rate depends on whether the other qubit is in a singlet or a triplet. So you get entangling because you're in a superposition of singlet and triplet. Now you do a simultaneous pi pulse on both qubits, again using our nuclear spins. So here both electron or both quantum dots have stabilized nuclear spin configuration. Let them evolve again, and any static fluctuation, as I said, is cancelled out. So then we're having this joint evolution at the end and joint readout of both qubits. We can do 2-qubit state tomography. So the idea is to measure both qubits simultaneously. So you get 4 possible measurement outcomes again, but with different pulses, measure them along all axes of the Bloch sphere. So Z, X, and Y, which you do by basically mapping each axis onto your readout axis. Again, it's also a standard technique. And what you get out from that are 15 different values. First of all, the expectation values or the averages of each individual measurement. So for example, measuring only qubit 1 along x, y, and z. The same for qubit 2 here. These are over here. And then 9 different correlations between different measurements on the 2 qubits. And these are the ones that are interesting for entanglement. What you can reconstruct from that is the complete 2-qubit density matrix and then ask, well, what state have I generated? And now here is, after some single qubit corrections, is what our data looks like. You see that all the single qubit expectation values here are pretty close to 0, and that's exactly what you expect from an entangled state. If you have the 2 spins entangled and you only measure 1, it's equally likely to have an up or down state. So the averages are near 0, so one state would be 1 here, the other state would be -1. It's a different scaling than probabilities. But if you look at the correlations, there's 3 peaks that show strong correlations. That's just what you, for example, well, get for any of the Bell states. No matter what basis you measure them, as long as you change your basis in the same way on both qubits, you find strong correlations between them that are not classical. And, well, we can compare that to the expected state after correcting for the coherence. So we didn't quite hit it perfectly. This would only have the correlation terms and 0 single qubit terms, but you see a strong resemblance. And if we compute the overlap to the nearest Bell state, so the nearest perfectly entangled state, it's about 72%, and that is above the threshold for entanglement. You can also do this as a function of evolution time, how long the qubits had time to interact. You see that initially the entanglement is built up, you exceed this threshold, and then as the qubits evolve longer, they disentangle again, so the Bell state fidelity drops and then increases again, but you see that it doesn't quite recover to the same value. It continues to decay, and that is due to charge dephasing, as well as this, well, nice proof of principle, but not quantum computing. Great value of 70% is all due to charge dephasing. So, important conclusion is that right now, if one wants to do this charge coupling, the fidelity is still strongly limited by charge noise, and either one needs 2 orders of magnitude improvements or some better idea on how to couple qubits. Well, here's one somewhat better idea, but it doesn't really get much better, at least not in terms of coupling. So far we had just placed the qubits next to each other. If you now connect them with a metallic wire and maybe remove the dielectric around it, one can show theoretically through electrostatic simulations shown here, that the coupling range is much extended, or the coupling strength. So this red curve here in the corner is what corresponds to the experiment where you don't have this metallic coupler. So as you separate the dots further, the coupling decreases very quickly and you start out at 20 micro eV. If you now use different versions of such a coupler, so just a floating metal gate, the coupling can either be increased by a factor of 3 or 4, or, which I think is even more exciting, extended to a range of about 10 microseconds. So here, micrometers. Here with qubits 10 micrometers apart, the coupling is about as strong as it was in the experiment for without this coupler. So you might hope to have the same gate fidelity at 10 micrometer coupling distance if charge noise doesn't change, which is a non-trivial assumption. However, there's a couple of challenges to this approach which makes me doubt that it's really something good for a scalable quantum computer. First of all, this coupler also picks up other charges. It works a little bit like an antenna, so probably the T2 would go down a bit, and there's some early indications that that happens indeed. Second, if you do something to this qubit, there will be crosstalk to this one through the charge coupler, and well, that's okay for 2 qubits. We had to deal with that, but once you have many of them, that becomes annoying because all your controls become correlated. And moreover, the coupling to the next to nearest neighbor only decays by something like a factor of 1/4, we estimate. Actually, Simon did the simulation in his bachelor thesis here. So that means you have pretty significant next to nearest neighbor coupling that all needs to be taken into account when running a big cluster of such qubits. And that, it doesn't make it impossible, but is relatively cumbersome to use it. So not so optimistic about that actually being a viable technology. What I think is more interesting is something that is pursued actually in different groups, is shipping electrons from one qubit to the other and hoping or making sure that the spin coherence survives. One approach there is to use surface acoustic waves. So it's basically acoustic surface waves traveling over the chip, which generate electric potential dips. And it's been shown that these can be used to transfer charges from one dot over a couple of microns to another one and back and forth with high probability. But the challenge there is to maintain spin information. And well, estimates don't look so bad, but first experiments so far show partly maintenance of, nothing I'm involved in, so done at Grenoble, show partly maintenance or conservation of spin information, but not perfect, far from perfect. Another alternative would be to basically do a chain of dots and use electrostatic gates to transfer electron spins along. Gives a little bit more control knobs than these traveling acoustic waves. So I think that's a very critical part for semiconductor qubits of any kind, how to couple them over larger distances. It looks like these cavities that work so well for superconducting qubits, they just couple relatively weakly, and it's not clear that that will provide a viable alternative for high fidelity 2-qubit gates. Now, I promised a little bit about scalability. So, well, let's do this one first. If you think, I think it's sometimes nice to keep an overview of what quantum computing can do and what you need in order to realize that. One well-known application is prime factorization. The NSA likes that a lot. If you look into best estimates right now on typical clock speeds, I think of 100 megahertz or so, to factorize a 1024-bit number, which is considered safe for classical computers, for encryption purposes, or impossible on classical computers, it takes something like 500 million qubits, and they need about 1 day. What I find more exciting is doing quantum chemistry. Perhaps at some point, that's not my idea, what the quantum simulation experts say, this could be used for designing catalysts for CO2 capture or fertilizer production. You imagine these are pretty big markets and pretty big impact, not just economical. And if you do something kind of the smallest molecule that becomes classically difficult, you might need something like 10 to the 5 qubits and 3 minutes or so, including error correction. If you do something more complicated, this is alanine, some moderately complicated organic molecule, you back to 100 million qubits and a couple of days. So you can do exciting things in a reasonable amount of time, but you need a lot of qubits. If you ask why, how does this come about, very roughly, I mean, don't quote me on orders of magnitude, but to do something, you need something like 10,000 logical qubits, for example, to represent these numbers and do operations, or to represent the quantum states of the molecule. Then in order to do many 10 to the 9, 10, 20 operations, you need 1,000 logical qubits per physical qubit, based on the surface code that Barbara might have told you something about. And then on top of that, your surface code cannot do all possible gate operations. You have about a factor 10 overhead to implement certain gates. You're at 10 to the 8 qubits. And there's certainly improvements there. I think this can drop by an order of magnitude, but if it's much more than that, I'm not, well, you never know what happens in the future, but I'm not terribly optimistic that theory can help us all that much there. And a lot is still a lot, so, or 10 times or tenths of a lot is still a lot. Yes?
Do you actually really need this large number of logical qubits to do these calculations, or is it a question of efficiency? Yes, if you take out error correction.
Well, I mean, the logical qubit means it's the qubits without error correction. That's what you would need if you had no error correction. And of course, there's trade-offs between runtime and the number of qubits. So you can take it to few less and let it run more longer, or you can add qubits and it's faster. Lots of details to vary, but these are just some rough ballpark values for orientation. And I mean, you see that a 1024-bit number, you at most have an order of magnitude until you have as many bits as in your computer as in your number. So that there isn't all that much wiggle room. It's a lot. I'm not going to argue about 1 million or 100 million. It's a lot. So now how can we realize this? Then bringing down 1 million wires into the fridge, each a millimeter wide or so, makes a big piece of copper. Doesn't feel right. And if you do estimates, even with small control cards, if you control everything at room temperature, you have a pretty big classical control thing that fills half a building. I think someone was saying you'll pretty quickly get to half the Empire State Building if you use current technology. So that's not what I mean by scalable. But on the other hand, if you say, let's space our qubits on 10 microns apart, it's a bit hard for current superconducting qubits, but for the semiconductors, the only problem is how do you couple them over that distance? They're nice and small. I think we need this distance to place classical control electronics. Then 100 million qubits are a convenient 10 by 10 centimeters chip. It's a factor of a few larger than what's sitting in there, and can easily fit to the bottom of the fridge. So it doesn't look so bad. So what I would envision a computer to look like is to put all of this into the fridge, one integrated processor. But that means that all the classical logic that sits at room temperature right now, and our box is that big, or well, at least this big, depending on what you use, needs to go on the chip and fit roughly on the footprint on one qubit cell. And then all the qubits, of course, need 2D nearest neighbor coupling to run surface code things. So now you have 400 watt equipment or a couple of 100-watt equipment burning a lot of power to generate these high frequency pulses. You want to put 100 million or so, say 1 million, into a fridge that has maybe cooling power of 1 milliwatt. Maybe that develops a bit. Seems daunting, but if you think of a few tricks you can play, for example, you don't drive long lines. You have your pulse generators right next to the qubits. Qubits don't draw current. They are just capacitive loads. You work at low temperature, so you can scale down all the operating voltages, in theory, of your electronics. You just need to develop the right kind of transistors. Then a power budget of somewhat nanowatt per qubit does not appear entirely crazy. So you could actually fit 1 million or so qubits and run it into a current state-of-the-art dilution refrigerator. And I think that's a whole new aspect that people are thinking very little about, and it's could break symmetries between different kinds of qubits. For example, I'm not quite sure how easy it is to use microwave control in the same integrated way, or how much harder it is. Maybe okay, but may also be significantly harder to do the same thing on a low power budget. So I find it quite exciting to think about these and, well, look a little bit ahead what it needs to develop that. Complementary, I would say, to just adding a qubit here and there and going from 5 to 10 to 100 or so. All right, so I think this is a good time to stop. So thanks for your attention. I hope you got a nice overview. I'm happy to take a few more questions.